So good day, everyone who already joined. We will wait another minute as the attendee list is filling up to give everyone the chance to get to the beginning of the webinar. So Eric, I think it looks like the attendee list stopped oh, it's still going a little bit.
It's still going up.
It just stopped and it said, let's start. And now it's still going a little bit. So wait later another 10, 15 seconds.
Yeah. Cool.
So next up. So good day, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our show today. As a main introduction, it will be a little bit different maybe than you know it from classical webinars, because we see this more as a kind of how far it is possible as a workshop. So we will split it into two parts. In the first part, Eric and me will do a recap what browser content redirection does and everything else you need to know about it. And in the second part, we will stop the recording. So only the first part will be recorded. And then we do an open microphone and everyone can raise their hands, ask questions in the chat or directly ask it. And that part won't be recorded. So you don't need to be afraid someone is catching something which you shouldn't. So it's not the classical webinar. We already did this once in German and the people liked it. So hope you're going to enjoy it as well. So let's have a short look at the agenda. Obviously, we're going to start with a short introduction. Then we come to browser content redirection itself. So what does browser content redirection mean? How is it configured? What do you need to think about? You're going to see a short live demo. And then we are going to switch to the Q&A part to give you the possibility to ask whatever you like to ask in that area. You have two speakers today. One is me, I'm Jan-Hendrik Meyer, working for Citrix or now Cloud Software Group since nearly 5 years as a sales engineer and in the enterprise market. So Eric, up to you.
Yeah, thanks Jan-Hendrik for the introduction. A warm welcome from me as well. So glad so many people joined today at that early or even in the afternoon. Depends, as I see in the list. Yeah, my name is Eric Schreier. I'm a requirements manager at Unicon. I'm working with the Unicon product since 10 years now. So I'm really pleased to have Jan-Hendrik here. And we will do this as he described as more as a workshop. So yeah, let's start. Short introduction from my side to Unicon. I think Citrix is well known in the market. Unicon, not that much. So let's start with the short introduction of the Unicon company. So Unicon is a company based in Karlsruhe. We have around 60, 65 people on board. We are working most in this virtual environment, virtual desktop environment. So any kind of infrastructure you can think of, starting with the classic remote desktop services, to the VDI, to any kind of multi-session desktops, down to desktop as a service, of course, and every kind which is residing in the cloud is, yeah, that's where our customers are, and this is where we have our products. So our products that we provide since 2000 now are the products Elux, which is a Linux-based operating system, which resides on or which is installed on a hybrid client. So every device with an x86 architecture can basically run Elux. It could be a laptop, a new one, a repurposed one. It could be an older PC, a repurposed thing, or specially designed thin clients, either a classic stationary one everyone knows, or an all-in-one device. And all of this is managed via our management solution, which is cloud, the Scout Scout Enterprise Management Solution. As I said, we are looking into devices running on an x86, on the x86 architecture. So we don't care if this device is from of those vendors. We are completely hardware agnostic. So any kind of hardware you can get from those vendors seen here in the presentation could be used in combination with our operating system Elux and Scout as a management console. And with this, you can access basically any kind of a virtual infrastructure you can think of. So today we will talk about one greater aspect, which is the browser content redirection. And this is kind of a thing Jan has really a deep expertise, and so I hand over to him for the explanation.
Thanks a lot. So why are we talking about browser content redirection, and what does browser content redirection mean? So if I look at me personally, one of the tools I mostly use is my browser. We now moved from Citrix to Google Workspaces, so everything is now browser based. And my main tool I daily work with is my browser. And if you look on your VDA or in your endpoints about the usage of your browser, of the resources, you see that the browser CPU utilization during the last years got higher and higher, and the RAM consumption got higher and higher. And the more efforts you have on your VDA, the more you must add to your data center, or you need to find a way to remove this browser and browser CPU and RAM utilization from your VDA. So to give you an example in this one, I just watched an internal training video or kickoff video on a VDA, and you can see that our Google Chrome itself already had quite a good usage, but as an add-on, you also have the HGX graphics engine. So just by watching this one video, and there was just one user on the system, you already generated a lot of load on the system because everyone at that time was watching the video. So you can imagine how much load was just generated because this one video was watched. So what does browser content redirection do? Browser content redirection splits the browser into two areas. The above one is the user interface, and the below one is the viewport. And the important part is that the above one still stays on the VDA. So for the user, it still looks normally. I can control it like he's used to. He can create favorites and everything else. But the viewport, so the below part, is happening on the endpoint and are overlaid to the VDA session, so that the user is able to just open a website on the VDA in the browser and doesn't notice any different if the website is directly generated or viewed on the VDA or from the endpoint. If you look a little bit more on the details in browser content and the design considerations, there are three flavors how you can use browser content redirection. So the classical one without browser content redirection is where the VDA fetches the data from the internet, renders the data, and sends using HDX everything to the endpoint and shows it on the endpoint. So server-side render, server-side fetch. The first possibility, or one possibility with browser content redirection, is that you remove the rendering part from the VDA and move it to the endpoint. So now the VDA still fetches the internet traffic or the websites, but it's passed through like a proxy to the endpoint and now rendered on the endpoint and no longer on the VDA. So the CPU and RAM consumption gets lower on the VDA. And the last part is that the virtual desktop just shows the browser bar and everything else, and the content itself is fetched by the client and rendered by the client. So there's no longer an impact on the VDA because of the websites that are shown. When you have a look, obviously they all have different impacts. So classically, the CPU RAM impact is high on the VDA. The network impact is high because the traffic is still passing through, or everything is passed through the VDA. but you have no endpoint requirements. If you do the client-side render server-side fetch, the CPU and RAM impact on the VDA gets lower, but in contrast, you still have the network impact because the traffic is still passed through the VDA and not directly received from the endpoint, from the internet or from anything else. But you have some endpoint requirements. It's Windows or Linux, and shortly we added also Chrome OS. And last but not least, for the VDA, the most relaxed variant is client-side renders, client-side fetch, where you have the less impact on CPU RAM and also no network impact on the VDA because everything is directly handled by the client. But you still need to know, you must make sure you have the correct endpoint, and the endpoint now needs direct internet access, which in many environments, especially more secure ones, is not so easy possible. So there are some requirements when you plan to implement it. In the old versions, you had to manually install browser content redirection as a separate MSI on the VDA. This is gone, so you don't need to take care of this. It's part of the standard installation, so no extra installation. But you need a current Chrome or Edge based on Chromium versions that are used. You need to install a plugin to them to get it working. On the endpoint side, you must use Windows, Linux, or Chrome OS, and Chrome OS are only since the beginning of the year. And even more important, if you're using Windows endpoints and you're using the Windows Workspace app LTSR version, that is not supported because inside the Workspace app, we have integrated a Chromium engine, and this requires regular and frequent updates. And this is in contrast to the LTSR version. So this Chromium part was removed from the Windows Workspace app LTSR version. And thus you can't use it for browser content redirection. When you're using it on Linux, there are two things to consider, especially on older devices. In the past, we used web container, and you can see in the below right part, there are several requirements when using web container. Websites even look differently than the users used to from Chrome or Edge on Chromium because it's a different rendering engine. We moved this to since 2106 to the Chromium embedded framework. And one point, if you're redirecting internal websites, you need to make sure that this Chromium engine is aware of internal root certificates if the internal websites are secured by SSL. So it's not like adding it to the Workspace app itself. It must be separately added to the Chromium embedded framework. So their actual configuration is quite simple, or the basic configuration, it's better to say. It's quite simple. You have like two policies you need to be aware of. So one is browser content redirection in general. You just need to enable it so it's allowed. And the more important one is the ACL configuration. This is used to define the FQDNs that you plan to redirect. So you can redirect like youtube.com or citrix.com, unicorn.de, or anything. In the past, we did not support wildcards before the name of the domain. Since, or I think the last release, we also support wildcards in front of the domain. No complete wildcards, so it's always still a domain, but at least for the beginning of the domain, you can add a wildcard. Next to that, inside the browser, you need a browser extension, which must be installed in the user context, because we need to be somewhere aware which website is open and if it must be redirected. And one tricky point, if you would like to use server fetch and client render and not client fetch client render, which is the default one, you need to configure policy. And that policy is not server fetch client render. That policy is proxy configuration for browser content redirection. And you need to enter direct for server fetch client render if the VDA has direct internet connections. There are other ones for server fetch and client render, other proxy options that you can configure. So the classical PAC file or VPIT file. So just enter it so it can be used. Direct if the VDA has direct internet connection, which can be used for the connection, or a static web proxy can also be used. Disabled switches back to client fetch client render and no server fetch is used. So this is the important point to know, that you need to use this policy for activating server fetch. And
Yeah,
here we
and
go to Unicorn.
this is now my part on the Elux client, or especially now on the Scout server settings. There are only a few things to install or to configure. As Jan-Hendrik mentioned, the thin client now needs direct access to the internet, which is in some cases, it's quite easy, but usually in an enterprise, you will have to have a direct, not a direct connection, but a connection over a proxy. So this is something you will have to add for your network profile, so that everything is rooted, every web content or every access to a web should be routed over the proxy. So this is in this case in the profiles and the network profiles, you set either the proxy, or you can also accept or some of these internal addresses, for instance. You can use a logon, of course, for the proxy, but it has to be a connection to the internet if you want to use this client fetch, client render. And this is pretty easy to configure on the Scout server. These are the two screenshots. So you go into the base device configuration or into the configuration of an OU. You edit the LAN profile and add the proxy, including the port. And that's basically it from the configuration side for the client itself. Of course, the client has to be configured, or there has to be some features, of course, activated. And this I will show you in a second. This is something which has to be done on the back end, in addition to our backend.
So you've seen that Eric showed the client fetch, client render proxy option. I showed before the server fetch, client render proxy options. But when you're using server fetch and client render, you still might need that there's an authentication to the proxy. And if you look at the policies, there's one policy, which is obviously server fetch proxy authentication. You can enable that one. Unfortunately, that is not enough. So this won't help you because most people don't realize that there's a small point noticed in the description, and that is only working when it's configured in pack file mode. So you need to configure the proxy configuration with a pack file and can't use direct or anything else like that. So for proxy authentication, you also must configure the proxy configuration to pack file. It's often not noticed, and people then are wondering that why the proxy authentication fails in server fetch client render, although they enable the policy, because then they didn't use this in combination with the pack file. And also really important, it's limited to Kerberos service tickets, so your proxy must support that to use it.
Yeah, and now the things that have to be installed on the Elux client itself, there is an additional one. I would like to show you this in the live demo. I'm just switching my information now here to the desktop, and we have our Alias tool, which is Elux image administration service. And here I just can configure anything which is relevant for my endpoint device. So in this case, I would like to add the client to it, which is a Citrix Workspace app. So I put this one into here and configure it according to my needs. So some of these features will be mandatory already, but for using the BCR, the browser content redirection, I will have to activate, of course, in this package, the browser content redirection. Everything else is now here listed, will be solved in a minute. So let me just save this one as a minimum image, which I can install on an Elux, on a thin client, on a hybrid device. I run the solver. So everything will be now put together to make this Citrix Workspace app with the included browser content redirection to work. So you see some additional packages that come with it. So the base OS, of course, our desktop environment, some Elux extensions. Then, of course, because we don't know what codec will be used for the browser content redirection, you will need the browser, the Fluendo system-wide codec pack, so that every content is really handled properly on the Elux device. And then we have an additional feature which we need to install, which is the Fluendo FFmpeg enabler. And this is something which needs to be also installed on the device. Let me just check it out where it is. Utilities. Am I scrolling it not correctly? Fluendo miscellaneous. There it is. Fluendo FFmpeg enabler, and you see if I put it into here, there is a feature which has to be activated. This is something which some of our customers have stumbled across because they put everything into it, but this one isn't be solved by default. So I click solve again, and you will see in the Fluendo FFmpeg package that only these two features are enabled by default, and to use the full functionality of the browser content redirection from the Citrix Workspace app, you will have to activate this as well. So in this case, I solve it again. I save the image, which I have now created. So this one is now ready to deploy on any of one of my devices. And if I take a look into it, it would be an image with a size of roughly 1.4 gigabyte, which comes to the client. There is everything on it referring to browser content redirection. So this is then put onto or installed onto the hybrid client, and we can use it afterwards on the Elux device. So then we take a short look onto an Elux device right now. So let's just think. So here in this case, I don't have a browser redirection extension installed. And as Jan-Hendrik mentioned, this has to be done in the user context. So from this perspective, I now, as a user, have to install this browser redirection extension. And with this, I can now use, I can use now this this browser content redirection after that. Obviously, I have an error from deinstalling and reinstalling. But in the end, you will see as soon as you switch to a YouTube or any kind of a website where I have a web content which can be redirected, you will immediately see this browser redirection extension highlighted here in the address bar, and you will see immediately that the full content is really rendered on the device itself. So let me just shift this over. This is on the client side. This is quite an easy way to activate the browser content redirection in an enterprise scenario, just by activating two additional features. The feature is one is the browser content redirection. Then, of course, the Fluendo package will be installed as a as a dependency, but then you will have to install the Fluendo FMPEG enabler as an add-on with the BCR feature also activated. So this is something, unfortunately, now my demo is not working, as you have seen from testing and the deinstalling and reinstalling again. But Jan-Hendrik already mentioned that the workload on the VDA on the server is now running really low. As we can see it here, this is live description from my task manager, which I put into here. So the Citrix graphics engine is down to 0 from the CPU load. It requires a little bit of RAM, of course, but the majority of the work is done by now the Elux client and the endpoint itself. Yeah,
So,
and of course,
also, browser content redirection has some nice advantages and helps you to remove your load on your central systems, on your VDAs, on your data center. It also honestly has some downsides. And the downsides are obviously because everything is redirected to the endpoint that happens on the endpoint. So that means if you click a download link on a website, that happens on the endpoint. If you want to print something, it should happen on the endpoint. The RAS is limited to Windows, Linux, and Chrome OS. So browser content redirection is not a technology to redirect every website to get all browser stuff offloaded from your central systems and don't generate any loads here. It's more for multimedia websites or video webcasts or like unified communication solutions that are in a browser to offload that. As long as no interactivity for downloads, printing, and things like that is necessary. Because if you're doing that with like I've seen one trying to redirect a banking website because a banking website was always playing a video in the background. So discussion if that's good for a banking website, but that was it. And then the users suddenly had big issues because they were not able to properly work any longer on this website. Because all the limitations occurred because it did not happen any longer on the VDA on the server side. And with that, I think we get to the Q&A and the open discussion part. We will stop the recording now, and if you have a question, feel free to use chat the Q&A part, but otherwise also feel free to raise your hand so we can give you your rights to unmute yourself, because we would be really happy if